My name is Alex Hartmann. I'm a partner in the construction team at Baker McKenzie Sydney office, where I deal with both front-end non-contentious contract drafting work and also the resolution of disputes in the construction industry. I'm very pleased to be joined here today by the New South Wales Building Commissioner, David Chandler, who has a 40-year experience in the construction industry, including such highlights as working as construction director on the Federal Parliament House, as Deputy Chair of the Building the Education Revolution Implementation Review, and as an adjunct professor in the Faculty of Construction Management at the University of Western Sydney. Welcome, David.
Thank you for having me.
Now, David, if we cast our minds back to December 2018, our viewers will remember the rather distressing media photos of the occupants of the Opal Tower leaving pre-Christmas with their clothes on their back. And at that time, there was a great deal of concern regarding the quality of construction in the New South Wales building industry. Can you talk a little bit about the background to your appointment and the issues that you faced at that time?
Well, Alex, I think that really was the high tide mark of people's discontent with the construction product being delivered in New South Wales. So rightfully, the game had to be changed, and the government stepped up and said, right, we are now going to lead a New South Wales reform program to get this done once and for all. So that, over the next 6 months, led to a situation where the state appointed the first New South Wales Building Commissioner, and I was asked to take up that role. So what I want to make it quite clear is that some people initially said if it wasn't for the Opal Towers, there'd be no role for a Building Commissioner. Let me disabuse anybody looking at this interview. We have a serious problem with quality across this industry, and we've got to turn it round.
So when you were appointed to the position, what was your remit and how, if at all, has it changed in the 2 years since that time?
Well, my remit has essentially got three parts to it. The first is that it's unequivocally about advocacy on behalf of consumers. My job is to see what we are doing through the lens of consumers, first and foremost. That's the first piece, the advocacy bit. The second piece is advisory and involvement in policy. Then the third piece, of course, is the implementation of the legislation. And as we discussed, the transformation of the regulation agency in New South Wales. So standing up that transformation piece and making sure that by the time we get to the end of that, we've got a modern regulator deploying their effort at the really important front end of jobs rather than at the back end.
David, you've just explained the role of the modern regulator. Could you talk a little bit more about how you see the modern regulator functioning?
Essentially what we're doing is we're trying to still address problems with the industry that have been around for 20 years. So it's no good just doing a fix about what are the problems that exist, what are the harms that exist today. We need to quell those harms, and then we need to start to look forward and think about what are the future harms of the industry, because there's many coming. It won't be possible for a modern regulator to think that every building is assembled and organised in one jurisdiction. We're drawing from a global construction market. We've also got buildings that are getting smarter. So we're now starting to see artificial intelligence. So a modern regulator's got to understand what's happening on the customer journey in a modern building. But fundamentally, a modern regulator has got to use new tools that have never been used by regulators in the past, and that is going to be data-driven. We are going to be the most data-rich and strategically able regulator in Australia to apply data to achieve modern regulator outcomes.
Could you talk a little bit about how the data informs the actions that you take?
So data's everything. As of last week, I think my risk assessment capability of players is now informed by over 142 million lines of data. And I think if anybody thinks in this day and age there's a place to hide, then you really need to get real. You are now 20 years into the 21st century.
That's an astounding level of capability there. In terms of your strategy to improve the trustworthiness of the construction industry, could we just drill down a little into the main planks of how you do that? There's obviously an investigation role, there's the statutory changes. Can you talk a little bit about how you see all of those, each of those planks coming together?
Well, one of the things that has confused people is this question of quality. What's a quality building? Well, we've stood away from that and said, well, quality is actually a choice of a consumer. You can have a high quality car or another car with lots of add-ons in it, but both of those products should be trustworthy. So we think prima facie that buildings should be trustworthy. Now, a trustworthy building is one that doesn't harm people in its making or in its use. And the harms that we believe that we should be addressing are physical harms, that they don't hurt people physically, they don't hurt them economically, and they don't hurt them emotionally. So they're the harms we're facing into. And it's interesting that when we start to get developers thinking about what does their brand look like and what does the meaning of their brand look like, suddenly trustworthy is becoming an important bolt-on. But we're making sure that people only use it if they're up to it.
Since your appointment, are you seeing cultural changes developing in the industry?
I think, Alex, the first thing I'm hearing is a lot of people sort of talking the talk, but I'm not sure there's as much walking the walk as walking the talk as there could be. But look, it's early days. But I am seeing green shoots. I'm seeing, for example, that the risky certifiers of the past are having trouble getting jobs with developers going forward because those developers realise that it's game over for poor quality occupation certificates and shorthand certification. We want buildings that are trustworthy, and that means that certifiers have to do their job or there will be consequences. If you're governing a job, what you want to know is that the pieces and parts, first of all, if it's a light fitting coming from overseas or a tap coming from overseas, you want to know it complies with the Australian standard. And then you want to know that the person who's going to put that in installed it in accordance with the Australian standard. Now, people have taken their eye off that ball for too long, but they are now facing into the fact that if you don't do it that way, then the cost of doing it the bad way is going to be very expensive.
I think one of the themes that comes through is, the stitch in time saves 9.
Well, Alex, there were assertions when I was first appointed that I was going to drive up the cost of construction and make construction less affordable. The reality is that if I go and talk to the players that do good quality work and are trustworthy, their response is doing it right is going to cost us no more than what we've ever done in the past, because that's what we do. What you're doing is you're actually levelling the playing field for those people who are raping and pillaging at the margins and passing defective work onto consumers to wear at a later date.
A lot of our audience are not just watching this in a commercial capacity, they're watching as potential buyers of property. If you were buying an apartment, what would you be looking for?
What you need to avoid is being dazzled by a brochure saying, here's a quality building. What you need to do is look behind the brochure and make sure that the developer who is building the building has been around, has got a track record, and ask to go and say, well, give me an example of 2 or 3 buildings that you've built recently, and then go and ask some people who live in those buildings what it's like. Because I think consumers are making a very, very big investment. It's $750,000. If you were buying a $20,000 car, you would actually go and make much more inquiry than many people make regarding a $750,000 apartment. So check the developer out, have a look at the buildings they've built, and ask people who live in them what they think about them.
To wrap up, do you have a message for the construction industry?
Well, at every single level, this is the message that I would like everybody to take away from this, is that the Design and Building Practitioners Act in New South Wales will go live on the 1st of July this year. It changes the landscape. If you are going to cut corners, if you think you're just going to nickel and dime and try and save a few pennies on the way through, those days are over, because if you don't build it right, the cost of redoing it is going to be very expensive.
Thank you for watching Boardroom Media today, and for joining David, Chandler and I for this presentation on an issue which affects not only our commercial but our day-to-day lives.